A man rode into town the day they were selling a dead woman's dream. Nobody expected him. Nobody wanted him. And by the time the sun went down, nothing in Red Hollow would ever be the same. The auction was already halfway through when the dust cloud appeared on the western ridge. Evelyn Mercer stood at the edge of the crowd with $18 in her pocket and a deed that would stop being hers before nightfall. The auctioneer's voice carried across the dry square like a hammer on tin. Silas Boone sat in the front row, one leg crossed over the other, patient as a man who already knew how the story ended. He'd made sure of that. Then someone pointed at the horizon. If this story already has you gripped, hit that like, drop your city in the comments, and follow along. I want to see exactly how far this ride is going to take us. The summer Red Hollow nearly died. It didn't announce itself with anything dramatic. No single catastrophe, no one morning when people woke up and understood what was happening. It came the way drought always comes, like slowly, then all at once. First the creek running shallow in April when it shouldn't have, then the wells dropping through May. By June the ground had cracked open in long seams across the valley floor, and the grass that had once made the Mercer land worth fighting for had turned the color of old bone. Evelyn Mercer was 26 years old, and she was the last one standing. Her father had died 2 winters back, heart that quit on him between the barn and the house, the way hearts sometimes do when a man has been working himself to pieces for 30 years. Her brother had left for Colorado before the drought, chasing some mining story that hadn't panned out from what she could tell since she hadn't heard from him in 4 months. The ranch hands had gone one by one as the money stopped, leaving politely at first, then not so politely, and finally just leaving in the night without saying anything at all. What remained was 1,200 acres of cracked earth, 43 head of cattle that were getting thinner by the week, a farmhouse with a sagging porch, 2 horses, and a debt that Evelyn had only recently understood the full size of. The debt was the thing she hadn't known about. Or rather, she'd known there were loans. Yeah, her father had taken them when prices were good and expansion felt inevitable, but she hadn't known about the second set of papers, the ones her father had signed with the First Territorial Bank of Red Hollow, which had since changed hands and was now operated by a man named Silas Boone under the name Boone Land and Credit. She'd found out about those papers in March, when a man in a clean suit rode out from town and left a stack of documents on her kitchen table. He'd been polite about it, almost gentle, the way people are when they're delivering news they know is going to break something. The short version was that her father had borrowed against the ranch twice, and that the collateral on the second loan was the land itself. All of it. The bank, Boone's bank now, held the right to foreclose if payments were missed, and they'd been missed for 8 months. Evelyn had read the documents 3 times at the kitchen table that night, going back through the numbers with a lantern burning low. She'd thought maybe she was misreading something. She wasn't. She'd spent April and May trying to find a way out of it. Rode into town and had conversations with men who sat behind desks and told her things that added up to, there's nothing to be done. She'd written to her brother twice with no response. She'd sold 2 steers she couldn't really afford to sell and put the money toward the interest, which barely moved the needle. She'd asked around about refinancing with a different lender and had watched men across various desks exchange looks over her head that they thought she couldn't see. By June, she was out of moves. The auction had been announced in the Red Hollow Gazette on a Thursday. Mercer Ranch. Public auction, June 28th, followed by a list of assets and legal language she'd stopped reading partway through. She'd seen the notice posted on the board outside the general store when she rode in for supplies. 3 other people were reading it at the same time. None of them looked at her. The morning of the auction, Evelyn woke before the sun and sat on the porch steps with a cup of coffee that had gone cold without her noticing. The land stretched out in front of her in the gray pre-dawn light, flat and fractured, nothing moving on it. She'd lived on this land her whole life. Her mother had died on it. Her father had worked himself to death building it up from a 160-acre homestead into something that had, at one point, been worth considerable money. She was wearing her good shirt, which she'd pressed the night before, and her father's hat, which she'd taken to wearing in the months since he'd gone. Not for sentiment exactly, just because it fit better than her own. She didn't cry. She'd used up whatever was available for that somewhere around May. She got up, emptied the cold coffee off the side of the porch, and went to saddle the horse. Red Hollow wasn't much of a town. It had started as a way station on the freight road between two larger settlements and had grown into the kind of place that kept threatening to become something real but never quite managed it. There was a main street with a general store, a feed merchant, a saloon called the Spur and Saddle, a bank building that had Boone Land and Credit stenciled on the window in fresh gold paint, a livery, a barber, and a land office that doubled as the post. The sheriff's office sat at the far end, usually quiet. There was a church at the edge of town that Evelyn hadn't been inside in years. The courthouse steps, where auctions were held by tradition, fronted a two-story building in the middle of Main Street that served as both town hall and justice of the peace. By the time Evelyn arrived at 9:30, there were already 30 or 40 people gathered, more than she expected. She tied her horse at the rail and walked through the edge of the crowd, and people moved without quite looking at her, the way people do when they've already decided not to be involved in something. She recognized almost all of them. The Donahue brothers from the cattle operation up the North Valley. Old Pete Sargent, who'd been on his land since before Red Hollow was a town. The widow Carver, who ran the boarding house. Twice Johnson, the blacksmith, who everyone called Twice for reasons nobody remembered anymore. Clara Hatch, who owned the general store with her husband, standing with her arms folded. A few of them nodded at Evelyn. Most didn't. Silas Boone was already there, seated in a chair someone had brought out specifically for him, positioned to the right of the courthouse steps in the good shade. He was a large man, not fat exactly, but substantial, with the kind of face that had probably been handsome 20 years ago and had since thickened into something that communicated mostly authority. He was dressed well, always dressed well, and he had two men standing behind him who worked for him and whose names Evelyn knew were Denton and Cole. She didn't know much else about them except that they'd shown up in Red Hollow around the same time Boone had, which was about 3 years ago, and that they had a way of standing near things that made the things feel threatened. Boone caught her eye across the crowd. He didn't smile, didn't nod, just looked at her for a moment and then looked away, the way you might look at a transaction that was nearly complete. Evelyn found a spot to stand near the back of the crowd. She wasn't sure why she'd come, really. There was nothing she could do. She had $18. The minimum opening bid on a 1,200-acre ranch with cattle was going to be 15 times that. Easy. And Boone's team had almost certainly prepared their own number. She'd come because it was her land and she thought she should be there for the end of it, the same way you stay in a room when something is dying even when there's nothing you can do. The auctioneer, a thin man named Alcott, who came out from the county seat for these things, climbed the steps and shuffled his papers. Boone leaned over and said something to Denton without looking up. The crowd settled. Alcott opened his mouth. That was when someone in the crowd said, "What in hell is that?" Not a question, just an observation, the kind people make when they see something they weren't expecting. Several heads turned west. Evelyn turned too. There was a dust cloud on the western ridge, maybe a mile out, moving fast. In the time before anyone knew who Rhett Callahan was, the dust cloud was just a dust cloud, and people turned back to the auctioneer and the business at hand. Alcott cleared his throat and started again, going through the procedural language about terms and conditions that nobody listened to. But the dust cloud kept coming. And it was moving at a pace that suggested the rider wasn't just passing through. By the time Alcott got to the opening bid, the rider was close enough that people could make him out. A single man on a dark horse, moving at a flat gallop down the freight road, not slowing down for the outskirts of town. There was something in the way he rode that caught attention. He wasn't in a hurry the way a messenger is, urgent and purposeful. He was in a hurry the way a weather system is, like the speed was just his natural condition. 200, Boone's man Denton called, before Alcott had even finished his opening sentence. The crowd stirred. That was a low bid for this property, low enough to feel like an insult, which it was. Boone wasn't worried about competing bids. He was just going through the required motions of an auction. 200, Alcott confirmed, looking slightly uncomfortable. "Do I hear—" "I'd hold on that," someone said from the back of the crowd. The voice was quiet. Not loud. Not theatrical. Just carrying in the way that voices carry when everyone else is already starting to shut up. The rider had pulled up at the edge of the gathering. The horse was dark bay, trail dusty, breathing hard from the run. The man on its back was somewhere in his mid-30s, lean in the way of people who don't eat regular meals, with a week or more of beard and trail clothes that had seen considerable weather. He wore a revolver on his right hip that looked like it had been drawn from often enough to be useful rather than decorative. His hat was pulled low against the sun, and he hadn't taken it off, which in this context was either rude or a statement, possibly both. There was a pause in the crowd that Evelyn, standing toward the back, felt rather than saw. A collective intake of breath, a recognition rippling outward from whoever was closest to the man and could see his face. "That's Callahan," she heard someone near her say. She'd heard the name. Everyone had heard the name. Rhett Callahan was one of those frontier figures who existed somewhere between reputation and fact. The kind of man who got talked about in saloons and around campfires in ways that were probably 60% true, which still left a considerable amount of story. What she'd heard, he'd tracked and killed 3 men across 4 territories for a bounty operation out of Abilene, then quit bounty work after something went wrong that nobody agreed on the details of. He'd worked cattle drives, broken up at least one land grab operation in the Panhandle, gotten himself shot twice by her count from the stories, and had a general reputation as a man who was dangerous to cross and unpredictable to deal with, and who had his own notions about what constituted fair. He was also, she'd heard, not someone who hired out. He didn't take jobs from ranchers or businessmen. He didn't take money for enforcement work. The only time he'd gotten involved in other people's problems, from what she knew, was when he decided he wanted to, for reasons that weren't always clear afterward. She had no idea what he was doing here. "Talk, Alcott," Callahan said, still seated on his horse, like getting down wasn't something he was prepared to commit to yet. "You want to stop for a minute?" Alcott looked at his papers. "Sir, this is a legal proceeding." "I know what it is." Callahan looked out at the crowd. He found Boone sitting in his shaded chair and looked at him for a moment without any particular expression. "Been riding for 2 days. Got some questions about this auction. They can wait a few minutes while I water my horse." Boone shifted in his chair. "This is a legal auction, Callahan. It proceeds according to—" "Boone," Callahan said the name like it tasted of something he'd already decided about. "I didn't ask you." The silence that followed was of a particular quality. Red Hollow was not a town accustomed to people cutting off Silas Boone mid-sentence. Boone had money, and Boone had Denton and coal, and Boone had paper on half the properties in the valley. People in Red Hollow were careful around him. Even people who didn't particularly like him were careful. Callahan didn't seem to be doing careful. Denton had straightened up behind Boone's chair, one hand moving slightly toward his coat. Callahan hadn't looked at him directly, but something in the set of his shoulders suggested he'd noticed. "I'd leave that alone," Callahan said, still not looking at Denton. "Whatever you're thinking about doing." Denton's hand stopped. "Wow." Evelyn pushed through the edge of the crowd toward where Callahan had dismounted. He was handing the reins off to a boy near the horse trough, pressing a coin into the kid's hand when she reached him. Up close, he was taller than he'd looked on horseback. A lot of men were shorter when you got to them, but not this one. "Mr. Callahan," she said. She kept her voice steady because she'd made a decision on the walk over that she was not going to seem desperate, even though she was completely desperate. "I'm Evelyn Mercer. This is my ranch being auctioned." He looked at her. His eyes were a light brown, almost amber, and he had the look of a person who was accustomed to making quick assessments and didn't bother hiding that he was making one. "I know who you are," he said. "Then you know there's nothing I can do to stop this." "I know that's what it looks like." She waited. The crowd was watching them from a distance, trying to look like they weren't watching. "I've been looking at land in this valley for 2 months, he said. He wasn't talking loud. She had to step slightly closer to hear him clearly. 3 ranches sold off this spring, all of them to Boone. Hendrick's Place, the Salter Homestead, and 2 parcels on the creek that belonged to the Finney family. "I know. All of them sold at auction after the owners couldn't make payments on loans held by Boone Land and Credit. You see a pattern." "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I've seen the pattern. Seeing the pattern doesn't help me right now. What are you doing here?" He was quiet for a moment, not thinking. He didn't have the look of a man who was trying to decide something, more like he was choosing how much of a decision he'd already made to let her see. "I want to make you a proposition," he said. "Not the auction. Something else." They moved to the side of the building, away from the crowd. Alcott had recessed briefly, whether because he felt the weight of the situation or because he was waiting for Boone to give him some signal, she couldn't tell. 3 days, Callahan said. What? You give me 3 days on that land. I've looked at the survey maps. I've talked to a man who knows this valley going back 20 years. There's water under your eastern section, Evelyn. Underground aquifer, probably fed from the ridge system up north. She stared at him. You have survey maps of my land? I had to buy them off the county clerk. Paid $4. You owe me $4. Despite everything, she almost laughed. It came out as something else, not quite a laugh. If there's water under that land, the ranch isn't worth what it was last year. It's worth 5 times that. Drought-proof land in a valley that's drying up. He looked at her directly. It also means Boone knows about it, and he's been working specifically to get that land before anyone else figures it out. That landed differently than she expected. It wasn't that she hadn't considered that Boone might have ulterior motives, but she'd been thinking about debt and foreclosure and legal documents. The idea that her land had a specific value she hadn't known about, and that someone had engineered its loss specifically to capture that value, that was a different shape of thing. Why do you care? She asked. You could buy the land yourself. If you know about the water. He didn't answer that immediately. I can buy a lot of land, he said finally. That's not the question I'm thinking about. What question are you thinking about? Whether Boone's going to get away with this again. This is the 4th time in 6 months. She studied him. He was standing with his weight slightly back, hat still on, arms loose at his sides. There was nothing in his posture that was asking for her understanding or her approval or anything else from her. He'd laid out a proposition and now he was waiting for her answer, the same way he might wait at a card table. What do you get out of it? She asked. If this works, nothing you need to pay for. That's not what I asked. Something shifted slightly in his expression. Not quite a smile. Boone's been doing this across 3 counties. He's got judges and clerks in his pocket in 2 of them. I've been putting together a picture of it for a while. This is the piece that cracks it open, if we can prove the water was there and he knew about it. She said. It's your land. The delay she bought from Alcott was 40 minutes, on the technical grounds that she was questioning the validity of the foreclosure proceeding and needed time to consult with someone who could be described loosely as legal representation. Alcott was not comfortable with this. Boone was less comfortable than that, and made his discomfort known through the controlled stillness that was his version of anger, which was somehow worse than if he'd just raised his voice. This is a legal proceeding, Boone said, when she approached him directly. She'd decided to do it herself rather than send Callahan, because she didn't want Boone to know she'd handed him any power over how she managed this. It cannot be delayed on the basis of a procedural challenge regarding the terms of the original loan agreement, she said, keeping her voice flat and businesslike. She'd had 40 minutes to think about how to phrase this, and she'd used them. I have reason to believe there are discrepancies in the documentation. I'm entitled to review them. Boone looked at her. He had the practiced patience of a man who was accustomed to getting what he wanted through process rather than force. Evelyn, he said, dropping the formal register like he was being reasonable and familiar, I understand this is painful, but the documents are correct and you know that. Prolonging this only 40 minutes, she said. I'm not asking for more than that. He studied her for a moment. His eyes went past her to where Callahan was watering his horse, and something passed across Boone's expression that she couldn't read entirely, but that had the general quality of recalibration. 40 minutes, he said. Eat. She found Callahan afterward near the livery, where he'd gotten his horse fed and was sitting on the fence rail eating something that looked like hardtack and dried beef, which, given that he'd been riding for 2 days, was apparently what was available. He agreed, she said. Callahan nodded like this didn't surprise him. What now? Now I need to look at the eastern section, the area around the dry wash, the one that used to be a creek bed. I know the one. She'd played in that wash as a child, back when it had water in it. It had dried up 15 years ago, slowly, in the way things dried up in this part of the country. It'll take 2 hours to ride out there. Then we should go. She looked at him. You're just going to do this, just like that. Would you prefer I think about it longer? I'd prefer, she said, to know whether this is a real thing or something you're saying to give me something to hold on to for a day or two before the same result happens. He got down from the fence rail, brushed the crumbs off his hands. I don't say things to give people something to hold on to. That could mean you're certain this works, she said. Or it could mean you don't care what I hold on to. It means what I said. I've looked at the surveys. I've talked to a water reader named Hoskins who's been through this valley twice. The formations under your eastern section match aquifer patterns he's seen in 4 other places in this territory. 3 of them had water. He picked up his hat from where he'd set it on the fence post. The 4th didn't, so it's not certain, but it's not nothing. Evelyn considered this. She appreciated that he hadn't oversold it. Men who wanted to convince her of things tended to get smoother the further from the truth they were, and Callahan had not gotten smooth. He'd just said 3 out of 4. My horse is at the front rail, she said. The ride out to the eastern section took closer to 3 hours because Callahan wanted to stop twice along the way and look at things. The soil composition in a dry wash, the way certain rock formations ran through the hillside. He had a notebook that was battered nearly to pieces, and he wrote things in it without explaining what he was writing. Evelyn had spent her life on this land, and she knew it the way you know something you've never had to think consciously about. She knew where the footing went soft after rain, not that there had been rain. She knew where the fence posts needed replacing and where the old north pasture ran into the section she'd never fully cleared. She knew the sound the wind made coming through the gap between the eastern rise and the ridge, different from any other sound on the property, more hollow. But she'd never looked at it the way Callahan was looking at it, which was less like someone who belonged to land and more like someone trying to understand what the land was trying to hide. Your father ever drill out here? He asked when they stopped at the edge of the old wash. Once, when I was about 10, found nothing. Where exactly? She pointed. He walked out about 40 yards from where she indicated, crouched down, and dug at the ground with his boot heel. The soil here was different, darker than the surrounding flatland, with a faint trace of moisture that shouldn't have been there given the drought. She hadn't noticed that before. She wasn't sure she would have known what it meant if she had. 20 yards further north than where he drilled, Callahan said, standing back up. The formation runs northeast, not straight down. You'd miss it drilling straight. How do you know which direction it runs? He showed her the notebook, rough sketches of land cross-sections, notes in a handwriting she couldn't fully read. Hoskins, he said. He was out here in the spring. Told me if he had to guess, the water's about 40 feet down on a northeast angle from the old drill site, maybe 50. You've been planning this for a while. I've been building a picture for a while. I didn't know when I'd need to use it. She was quiet for a moment, looking out at the wash, at the cracked earth and the dead brush that had once grown along the waterline. She could remember when this wash had water running through it. Summer water, shallow and warm, the kind you could wade in as a kid without getting past your knees. The memory felt unreliable now, like something from a different world. There are people in town who are going to say you're running some kind of scheme on me, she said, taking advantage. I know. Are they right? He looked at her. The afternoon light was coming at a low angle and it caught the dust still in his hair from the ride. No. How am I supposed to know that? You're not, he said. Not for certain. You're taking a bet. Same as me. He looked back at the wash. But if I wanted something from your land, I could have let the auction run and bought it myself. That was true. She'd already thought about that. He had the money for it. She'd heard things about Callahan over the years, and one of the things she'd heard was that despite the trail clothes and the rough-and-ready reputation, he wasn't broke. He had money from the bounty years, carefully held on to, and he'd made some land transactions of his own over time that had done well. He could have sat in the back of that crowd and bought everything she had for a low auction price. He hadn't done that. She didn't know exactly what that meant, but it wasn't nothing. They rode the property for another 2 hours, Callahan making his notes and occasionally asking questions about drainage patterns and the locations of old springs that had dried up over the years. Evelyn knew all of it, could answer every question, had stored information about this land her whole life without knowing she'd need it. He listened without interrupting, without the polite but checked-out expression she sometimes got from men when she was explaining things. By the time they started back toward town, the sun was getting low and the temperature had dropped into something bearable. Drilling equipment, she said. You have access to that? I can get it here by tomorrow evening. That fast? I've been setting pieces in place for a few weeks. She absorbed that. You came here knowing you were going to do this. I came here not knowing whether there'd be anything to do, whether you'd be willing to try. A pause. A lot of people in your position, they've already given up. I've seen it. Someone has worked them over so thoroughly that by the time the auction happens, they're not really there anymore, just going through the end of it. I haven't given up, she said. There was some heat in it. I can see that. The town lights were visible ahead, orange and scattered in the dusk. She thought about what tomorrow would look like. Callahan organizing equipment, the two of them out on the eastern section, and Boone in town watching and waiting and almost certainly planning something to stop what they were doing. He's going to try to interfere, she said. Yes. His men are... I know what his men are. She looked at him sideways. You're not worried about them. I'm aware of them, he said. That's different from worried. What's the difference? Worried means you're not ready. Aware means you are. She thought about that as they rode the last stretch into town. She didn't know this man well enough to trust him, not fully, not in the way you trust someone you've known for years. But she trusted the logic of it, the fact that he'd had the surveys, that he'd talked to Hoskins, that he'd come 2 days' ride for something he could have done for himself and hadn't. People did things for reasons. She'd learned that watching her father, watching the men who'd worked the ranch, watching the people in town navigate around Boone's increasing grip on the valley. Everyone had reasons. She didn't fully know Callahan's yet, but they pointed in the same direction as hers, at least for the next 3 days. That was enough to start with. The arrangement they reached with Alcott, formalized in front of a small and skeptical crowd at the courthouse steps just before dark, was a 72-hour suspension of the auction proceedings on the grounds of a contested foreclosure challenge. Evelyn had Callahan lay out the legal basis for it, which turned out to be more substantial than she'd expected. There were actual provisions in territorial law about the validity of dual liens on homestead property, and the circumstances of the second loan her father had signed were, as Callahan put it to Alcott in a tone that left no room for argument, worth examining. Boone's lawyer, a nervous man named Pressfield who'd ridden out from the county seat specifically for the auction, objected on 7 separate grounds. Callahan answered 6 of them directly, and on the 7th said, "That's not what the statute says," and recited the relevant language from memory with enough confidence that even Pressfield didn't push back further. Alcott granted the suspension. Boone didn't say anything during this. He sat in his chair in the shade, which was mostly shadow now that the sun was almost gone, and watched. His face held the careful neutrality of a man who was running calculations and hadn't finished yet. Evelyn signed the suspension papers and shook Alcott's hand and walked back to her horse. Callahan walked beside her. "Pressfield's going to file a counter-challenge by morning," he said quietly. "Can he win it? He can slow us down. He can't win it." "You're sure?" "Sure enough." She untied her horse from the rail, paused with her hand on the saddle. The street was mostly empty now, people having drifted to their suppers and their own concerns. The saloon at the far end of Main Street was starting to get noisy. "You have somewhere to sleep tonight?" she asked. "I'll manage." "The boarding house is cheap. Mrs. Carver doesn't ask questions." "I'll find it." She swung up into the saddle. 6 in the morning, she said. "I'll meet you at the east gate. Bring whatever you've already arranged." "I'll be there." She started to turn the horse, stopped. "Callahan." He looked up at her. "Why didn't you just buy the land? You had the money. You knew about the water." He was quiet for a moment. The street noise from the saloon drifted over, a fiddle and somebody laughing at something. "Because it's not my land," he said, "and because buying it doesn't stop Boone from doing this again somewhere else." She looked at him for a moment longer, then turned the horse toward home. Behind her, she could hear Boone's men talking quietly near the courthouse steps, and then the sound of boots on the boardwalk moving in the direction of Boone's office. Something was being arranged. She was sure of it. She kept riding. 1,200 acres of cracked earth waiting in the dark behind her, and somewhere below it, maybe, the water that would change everything. 3 days to find it. The stars were out by the time she reached the ranch gate. She stopped there, looking at the dark shape of the farmhouse and the barn against the sky, and she thought, "This is still mine. For 3 more days, this is still mine." She pushed through the gate and rode up to the house. She didn't sleep much. Evelyn lay on top of the blankets in her father's old room. She'd stopped sleeping in her own room sometime in April, without quite deciding to, just drifting toward the larger bed and the window that faced east. And she stared at the ceiling and ran numbers in her head that didn't add up any better in the dark than they had in the daylight. 72 hours. Callahan had said he could get drilling equipment here by tomorrow evening, which meant they'd lose most of the first day just to logistics. Then whatever digging could be done before Pressfield's counter-challenge complicated things further. 3 out of 4, he'd said. She kept coming back to that. The water reader Hoskins had looked at 4 sites with similar formations and found water in 3 of them. She tried to think about the 4th one, the dry one, and couldn't stop herself from it. She was up before 5 ashorn. Eek. Callahan was already at the east gate when she arrived, which meant he'd gotten there before her, despite having to come from town, which meant he'd left before it was fully light. He was standing outside the gate rather than sitting on his horse, looking at the ground in the early morning the way he'd looked at it the day before. Not casually, but with the focused attention of someone reading text. With him were 2 men she didn't recognize, one older, stocky, with the sun-worked hands of someone who'd spent decades doing physical work outdoors, and one younger, maybe 19, who had the look of the older man in miniature. Father and son, she guessed. "This is Frank Weller," Callahan said, nodding at the older man. "He and his boy do drilling work out of Mineral Creek, best in the territory for shallow to mid aquifer work." "Miss Mercer," Weller said. He had a handshake like a gate hinge. "Heard about your situation. Sorry for it." "Thank you for coming." Mr. Callahan said there was work to be done. "We came." He said it simply, without the careful politeness of someone who wanted credit for it. Just a man who'd been asked to do a job. The younger one, who turned out to be named Dale, nodded at her without saying anything. He had a horse loaded down with equipment she couldn't fully identify. Lengths of pipe, a hand auger, coiled rope, various tools whose purposes she could guess at. "Equipment for the heavy rig is coming up from Mineral Creek by wagon," Callahan said. "Weller says it'll be here by early afternoon. What do we do until then?" "Hand bore some test holes, get a better sense of exactly where to put the main drill." Weller was already walking along the edge of the old wash, doing the same ground-reading thing Callahan had done the day before. He had a forked piece of willow in his hands, which Evelyn looked at skeptically. "Does that actually work?" she asked Callahan quietly. "Weller swears by it, and he finds water." A pause. "I don't know what it's doing, and I'm not sure he does either, but the results are decent enough that I don't argue with him about it." That was either reassuring or not. She wasn't sure. By mid-morning, they had 3 test holes along the northeastern line Callahan had identified from the surveys, down to about 15 feet each. The soil changed at 12 feet. Weller pointed it out to her without her asking, crouching at the edge of the 3rd hole and holding up a handful of the darker material that had come up with the auger. It was damper than anything above it, not wet, but not the bone-dry clay that made up everything in the top 10 feet. "It's there," Weller said. He wasn't being dramatic about it. He sounded like a man identifying a fence post that needed replacing. Factual, certain, a little bored with the obviousness of it. 25, 30 feet further down, I'd wager. Maybe 40. "You'd wager," Evelyn said. "I've been wrong before." He handed the soil sample to Dale, who bagged it carefully. "Not often, but I've been wrong." She appreciated that. She was starting to trust people less the more certain they were about things, which was a quality she'd developed recently and hadn't had before everything went sideways. The wagon with the heavy equipment arrived at noon, driven by another of Weller's men. By the time they had it unloaded and the rig set up over the most promising test site, it was after 2 in the afternoon, and they had maybe 5 hours of usable daylight. Callahan didn't hover over the Wellers while they worked, which Evelyn noticed and filed away. He found a flat rock near the edge of the wash and sat on it with his notebook and wrote things, occasionally looking up at the surrounding terrain. She brought water out from the house at one point. She'd thought to fill extra canteens that morning, and gave one to him without ceremony. "Thank you," he said. Don't thank me for water on my own property." He almost smiled at that. The first trouble came at 3 o'clock. Cole, one of Boone's men, rode up to the east gate alone, which was the detail that made Evelyn immediately cautious. Boone's people usually traveled in pairs. She was near the house when she saw him, and she walked out to the gate without waiting for Callahan. "Miss Mercer," Cole said. He was a compact, carefully put-together man who always looked like he was dressed for business, one level up from whatever was actually happening. He had good manners in the surface layer that covered something she'd never been able to fully identify. "Mr. Boone wanted me to let you know that Mr. Pressfield filed the counter-challenge this morning. It's been accepted by the circuit judge." "What does that mean for the timeline?" "It means the suspension may be reduced to 48 hours from the original 72. The hearing is tomorrow morning." She kept her expression even. "Thank you for informing me personally." Cole didn't move to leave. He was looking past her toward where the drilling rig was visible in the middle distance. Something in his eyes went through a calculation she couldn't track. "You're drilling," he said. "I'm doing work on my property." "That property is in foreclosure proceedings." "It's in suspended foreclosure proceedings," she said, "which means I still hold the deed, which means I can do work on it." Another pause. Cole looked at her directly now, and she had the sense that the surface manner politeness had been set aside for a moment. "Miss Mercer, Evelyn, whatever you find out there, and I want you to understand I'm saying this without any hostility, it doesn't change the underlying debt." "Well, if there's water on this land," she said, "the value of the land changes the conversation about the underlying debt considerably. Only if you can prove the debt terms were established under fraudulent conditions." He said it like a man reciting something he'd been told to say, but had been told it carefully enough that he'd memorized it accurately. "That's a very high bar." "Then I'll need to meet it," she said. She held his eyes until he looked away first, which took longer than she'd hoped. Then he turned his horse and rode back toward town at an unhurried pace, and she watched him go and tried to decide what exactly that visit had meant beyond the obvious. She went to find Callahan. He listened to her account without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He was counting the men," he said. "What?" "That's what he was doing when he was looking past you, counting the men we have here, 4, including you and me." He stood up from the rock. "Boone's going to try something tonight." "You don't know that." "Cole didn't ride out here to tell you about Pressfield's filing. He could have sent a letter. He came to see what we have and how far along we are." He looked at the drilling rig, then at the position of the sun. "We keep working until dark. Then we post watches." "I don't have men for that." "Weller's son will take one. I'll take one. You can sleep." He said it matter-of-factly, not as a favor, just logistics. "I'll take a watch," she said. He looked at her. "This is my land," she said, before he could say anything. "I'll take a watch." "Midnight to 3, he said. "Dale takes 8 to midnight. I take 3 to 6. "What about you taking a watch at 3 after being up all day?" "I've managed on less sleep than this." There was no point in arguing with that particular kind of statement. She'd heard it before from her father, from men who'd worked the ranch over the years, from anyone who'd spent enough time in conditions that made comfort a low priority. It wasn't bravado exactly. It was just information, chassou. They drilled until the light gave out, Weller and Dale working the rig in shifts while Callahan and Evelyn kept pace with the work, and she answered questions about the terrain that came up as they went deeper. At 20 feet, the soil was definitively different, darker, heavier, cooler to the touch when Dale pulled samples. At 22 feet, there was moisture that left a stain on the sample cloth. Weller didn't say anything theatrical. He just nodded once and kept working. At 28 feet, when they were losing the last of the light, the drill bit met resistance. Not the resistance of rock, but the different kind. The soft-edged pushback that Weller had apparently felt enough times to recognize immediately. He stopped the rig and crouched down to examine the sample. "We're close," he said. "Not tonight. Tomorrow. Early." Evelyn stood at the edge of the hole and looked down into it in the near dark, and she felt something she hadn't felt in months, which was a physical sensation in her chest that was not grief and not fear, and not even hope exactly, but some precursor to hope. The sense that the thing might actually exist, that she hadn't been running toward nothing. She didn't let herself have it fully. It was too early for that. The night was quiet until it wasn't. She was in the middle of her watch, 12:30 maybe, by her estimate, the stars telling her what they could, when she heard the horses. Not one. Multiple. Coming from the south pasture side, which was away from the main gate, which meant whoever it was had come around. She was at the drilling site when she heard it. She had the rifle she'd brought out from the house, her father's old Winchester that she'd been firing since she was 12. She wasn't a remarkable shot, but she was a decent one, and she was familiar with the rifle in the way of someone who'd used it practically rather than for sport. She fired once into the air. The horses stopped. From the direction of the barn, Callahan had taken a position near the barn because it was the most defensible secondary point on the property. She heard his voice carry across the dark. "That's close enough." A pause, horses shuffling, then a voice she recognized as Denton's. "We're just riding through." "South pasture fence is posted," Callahan said. His voice was level and not particularly loud, but it carried. "You'd have passed 3 signs." "Might have missed them in the dark." "Might have. Keep going south. There's a road about half a mile that way." A longer pause. Evelyn kept her rifle up and her eyes on the shapes of the horses in the darkness, trying to count them. 3, she thought, maybe 4. "Callahan," Denton's voice again, "you're making an enemy you don't need." "I've got a full inventory of those already," Callahan said. "Move along." They moved. Slowly, the sound of hooves on dry earth fading south and then east, curving back toward the road. Evelyn stood in the dark for another 10 minutes after the sound was gone, listening. Nothing came back. She went to find Callahan near the barn. "They weren't going to do anything tonight," he said, when she got to him. He was leaning against the barn wall, rifle across his arms. "Just wanted to see who'd react and how. Testing us. Testing whether we'd run or hold." She thought about that. "And tomorrow night?" "Tomorrow night depends on what we find tomorrow." She sat down on the ground with her back against the barn wall a few feet from him. The night was cooling down towards something tolerable after the brutal heat of the day. Above them, the stars were thick and clear, unobstructed by any cloud. "My father used to sit out here at night sometimes," she said. She didn't mean to say it. It came out because the position, back against the barn, looking at those particular stars, put her in a specific memory. Callahan didn't respond immediately, which was right. He didn't jump to say something about it. "He liked this side of the property," she continued, quieter. "He said the barn blocked the wind the right way. Sounds like he knew his land." "He did." A pause. "He also signed papers he shouldn't have, and trusted the wrong people, and left me with a debt I couldn't climb out of." Another silence. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable, where something honest had been said and didn't need a response. "People carry too much and make bad decisions about who to put it down with," Callahan said eventually. "Not as comfort, just as fact." "Doesn't mean they didn't know their land." She looked sideways at him. In the dark, she couldn't read his expression. "You said you quit bounty work," she said. "What happened?" He was quiet for a moment. She thought he wasn't going to answer. "Man I brought in was innocent," he said. "Wasn't obvious until afterward. The evidence looked clear, and the money was good, and I didn't ask the questions I should have asked." "What happened to him?" "He lived. That's the only thing that makes it something I can still look at directly." A pause. "But he spent 8 months in a territorial prison for something he didn't do, and 8 months is 8 months." She didn't say anything to that. There wasn't anything to say. "That's why you're doing this," she said eventually. "Not the water. Not Boone's pattern across 3 counties. That, underneath all of it." He didn't confirm or deny it. But she understood it as yes. They sat against the barn wall until she told him to sleep and took the last watch herself, the stars wheeling slow and indifferent overhead, the drilling rig a dark shape across the field that might mean everything or nothing by tomorrow afternoon. She was tired in a way that went past the physical into something older and harder to name. But she was awake. She kept her eyes moving across the dark property lines, and she held the rifle, and she stayed. The land was still hers. For now, that was enough. The water came up at 34 feet. Not a trickle, Not a seep that could be argued about or explained away as runoff or residual moisture from some rain event 6 months back. It came up the way real water comes up when you've found the vein. Sudden, cold, pushing against the drill casing with a pressure that made Dale pull his hand back and look at his father with something that wasn't quite disbelief, but was close to it. Weller crouched at the hole and put his fingers in the flow and held them there. He looked at Evelyn. "That's your water," he said. She was standing 6 feet away and she didn't move for a moment. The morning sun was still low and the air was cool, and the sound the water made coming up through the casing was a sound she hadn't heard on this property in 15 years, not since the wash ran in her childhood. It was a small sound. It was the loudest thing she'd heard in months. Callahan was standing behind her and slightly to the left. She turned and looked at him. "You knew," she said. "I thought," he said. "Knowing's different." She turned back to the well. Dale was already rigging a hand pump to the casing, working efficiently, not making a ceremony of it. Water spilled onto the cracked earth around the hole and the soil took it in immediately, thirsty in the way of something that has been waiting a very long time. She should have felt relief. She did feel relief, somewhere under everything else. But what sat on top of the relief was a sudden, clear anger, the kind that comes when you finally understand the full shape of what's been done to you. Because Boone had known. He'd known this water was here. He'd known it, and he'd constructed a mechanism to take her land before she could find it, and every person in Red Hollow who'd watched the auction get set up and turned their eyes away had been living under his influence long enough that they'd stopped questioning the things he arranged. "How long has he known?" she asked. Not to Callahan specifically, just out loud. "Survey office records go back 18 months, Callahan said. "Hoskins told me Boone hired him originally, paid him to assess the valley. Hoskins did the assessment, gave Boone the report, and then Boone let him go and filed the report under a false project name at the county office." "Hoskins told you that?" "After some convincing." A pause. "He wasn't proud of it." She stood at the edge of the well for another moment, listening to the water. Then she said, "I need to go to town." What? Callahan's first instinct was to slow her down, which she could see in the way he straightened up when she said it. He wasn't the kind of man who said, "Wait, be careful, think this through." But there was a version of all of that in his posture, a brief hesitation before he spoke. "Pressfield's counter-challenge hearing is this morning," he said. "I know. That's why I'm going. The hearing is about procedure. If you show up and start making accusations about Boone before you've got the documentation assembled..." "I'm not making accusations at the hearing." She was already moving toward the horse. "I'm making them in the street before the hearing. I'm making them where everyone can hear." "Evelyn." He said her name in a tone that wasn't quite a command but had some of the shape of one. "If you go in swinging before you've got everything tied down, he buries it. He's got Pressfield, he's got the judge. He's got all of that, whether I wait or not." She stopped and turned around. "You said yourself the water doesn't automatically void the debt terms. We need to prove fraud. We need people in that town to understand what he's been doing so that when the documentation comes out, they've already been thinking about it." She looked at him directly. "I'm not going in swinging. I'm going in with the survey records, Hoskins' statement, and the evidence that Boone's company filed a false report under a fraudulent project name at the county office. That's not nothing." He was quiet. "Is it nothing?" she asked. "No," he said. "It's not nothing." "Then let's go." The storm that had been building on the western horizon for 2 days finally made up its mind around 9 in the morning while they were still riding into town. The sky went the color of a bruise above the ridge, and the wind picked up from nothing to considerable in the space of about 20 minutes, throwing dust across the road in flat sheets that stung the eyes and made the horses difficult. By the time they reached Main Street, the first drops were falling, big scattered drops that hit the dust and left dark coins across the dry ground. The street was busy for the hour, people moving with the slightly heightened pace of anyone caught between wanting to watch something and needing to be under cover. Pressfield's counter-challenge hearing was set for 10 o'clock at the courthouse. It was currently 9:15. Alcott was standing outside the courthouse with his papers under his arm and a look on his face that combined official discomfort with the weather anxiety of a man whose hat kept almost blowing off. He saw Evelyn and Callahan coming, and something in his expression went through 2 or 3 changes before settling on cautious neutrality. Boone was already inside. She could see him through the window, seated, Pressfield beside him, both of them with the settled quality of men who'd arrived early to a meeting they expected to control. She didn't go inside. She stopped in the street. She'd thought about this on the ride in, going through the words while the storm built overhead. She wasn't a natural public speaker in the way of men who'd built careers on it. She'd always been more comfortable with one-on-one, where she could track the other person and adjust. A street crowd was different, but she'd listened to her father run the ranch, which meant she'd listened to him address men and make arguments and explain things to people who didn't always want to hear them. She knew how to project without shouting. She knew how to say a thing plainly. "I need everyone to hear something before this hearing starts," she said. The volume was right. People on the sidewalk stopped. Clara Hatch came out of the general store doorway. Old Pete Sargent was already outside, hunched against the building wall out of the wind. "My name is Evelyn Mercer. You all know that. Most of you were here 2 days ago to watch my ranch get sold." She kept her voice level. Not emotional, just clear. 2 days ago, I didn't know why this was happening to me. I knew I had debt I couldn't pay. I didn't know that the man I owed it to had a specific reason for wanting my land that had nothing to do with the debt. The courthouse door opened. Pressfield came out, saw what was happening, and went back in. She could see him through the window talking to Boone. "There is water under my eastern section," she said. "An underground aquifer that runs northeast off the ridge system. We found it this morning, at 34 feet coming up under pressure. Enough water to make my ranch drought-proof. Enough water to supply the whole valley in a dry year." She paused. Silas Boone knew about it. He paid a water reader named Hoskins to assess this valley 18 months ago. Hoskins found the water and gave Boone the report. Boone filed the report under a false name at the county office, so nobody else would see it, and then he spent the next 12 months engineering the conditions that forced my land into foreclosure. Boone came out of the courthouse. He was moving with the controlled urgency of a man who had decided to get in front of something before it got larger. Pressfield was behind him, and Denton and Cole behind Pressfield. "Miss Mercer," Boone said. His voice was the public version, measured, reasonable, carrying an undercurrent of wounded dignity that she recognized as a performance he'd done before. "These are serious accusations made without—" "I have the county records," she said. Not to him, to the crowd. The original survey filed under the name Callaway Land Assessment, project number 417. It was filed 16 months ago by Boone Land and Credit, using a corporate name that doesn't appear in any other document in the county filing system. She had the paper in her hand and she held it up. It was a copy. Callahan had gotten the original from the county clerk 2 weeks ago, before any of this had started. The original assessment report lists my eastern section by parcel number and describes a significant subsurface water formation consistent with what Frank Weller found this morning. The rain was picking up now. People were getting wet, and nobody was moving. "She's lying," Denton said from behind Boone. "Shut up, Denton," Callahan said. He said it quietly, from just behind Evelyn's left shoulder, and Denton shut up. Boone looked at Callahan for a moment. Something passed between them that Evelyn couldn't fully read, but that had the quality of 2 men who had been aimed at each other for a while and were now finally in the same space. "This is a matter for the courts," Boone said, pivoting smoothly, "not the street. Whatever Miss Mercer believes she's found, the appropriate place to—" "The appropriate place is exactly here," said a voice from the edge of the crowd. Everyone looked. It was Pete Sargent, who hadn't spoken at a public event in Red Hollow in years, who kept his own counsel in his own land and didn't involve himself in other people's business as a rule. He was 72 years old and had been in this valley since before the town existed, and he was not someone who bothered speaking unless he had something to say. "I lost water on my north pasture 2 years ago," Sargent said. "Same time frame she's talking about. Went dry in a June when the east well on Hendrick's place went dry too. I always thought it was the drought." He looked at Boone. "Hendrick sold to you in August of that year." Boone said nothing. "Finney lost their creek section in the spring," said someone else. Twice Johnson the blacksmith standing under the overhang of his shop doorway. They sold in May, to Boone Land and Credit. The rain was coming hard now. The street was turning to mud in the low spots, and the crowd had shifted under whatever overhangs and awnings were available. But nobody had left. Boone made his play at 10 minutes past 10, when the situation in the street had settled into an uneasy standoff, and Pressfield had retreated inside to prepare his legal arguments. His play was procedural, which was consistent with how he did most things. He had more moves on the legal board than the social one, and he knew it. The counter-challenge, Pressfield argued before Alcott in the courthouse while the rain hammered the roof, was supported by the circuit judge's preliminary ruling that the suspension had been granted on insufficient grounds. Territorial law on dual liens was less clear than Callahan had represented. The auction should proceed by the following morning at the latest. Callahan argued back. She sat beside him at the small table Alcott had set up in the main hall of the courthouse. It wasn't a real courtroom, just a room with chairs and a desk at one end, and she watched him make the argument with the same unhurried precision he brought to everything. He cited specific statute numbers. He referenced 2 prior cases, one from the territory and one from a state court whose jurisdiction was adjacent. He talked about the false filing at the county office and what it implied about the circumstances under which the loans had been structured. Pressfield objected 6 times. Callahan answered every objection. Alcott looked miserable. He was a man who processed routine paperwork and didn't enjoy being the fulcrum of something larger than that. "I need to take this under advisement," Alcott said finally. Pressfield started to object. Callahan cut him off. "That's appropriate," Callahan said. "Given the complexity of the questions raised, a considered ruling is warranted." It wasn't a win, but it wasn't a loss, which was what Boone had been angling for. Alcott gave himself until 4 o'clock. Outside, the storm had graduated into something serious. The rain was coming sideways off the ridge, driving the last people off the street into whatever shelter was available. Evelyn and Callahan stood under the overhang of the courthouse, and she could see the road to the east, back toward the ranch, was already running with water off the hillsides. "The drilling equipment," she said. "Weller will cover what he can." Callahan was looking at the sky with the expression of a man doing weather mathematics. "The well casing is in. The water's not going anywhere." A pause. "There's something I need to tell you." She looked at him. "Boone's lawyer made a phone call from the telegraph office this morning before the hearing. I had a man watching the office." He reached into his coat and produced a folded piece of paper. A note, written in someone's quick hand. The call was to a judge in the next county, a Judge Harlan Peel. He has jurisdiction over territorial land disputes. Boone's going to try to move the case. He's going to try to move the case to Peel's court. Peel has ruled in Boone's favor in 3 prior land disputes. She stood with that for a moment. Outside the overhang, the rain was loud and the sky was the color of iron. Can he do that? Move it? Not if we file our own motion first, but we'd need to file in the next 2 hours, and the documentation we'd need. He stopped. What documentation? The original survey records. The copies I have are usable, but a defense attorney would challenge the copies. We need the originals from the county filing office. He looked at her. Which is in Thornfield, 20 miles east. She calculated the ride against the storm currently happening. In this. They looked at each other. "I'll go," she said. "The road east floods in heavy rain. The low section by the creek, I know the road. I've ridden it in bad weather before." "Not in this." "Then I'll be careful." She pulled her jacket tighter and stepped out into the rain before she'd fully finished the thought. "I'll be back by 3. Keep Alcott from making any ruling until I'm back." "Evelyn?" He stepped out after her, and the rain hit him immediately, and he didn't flinch from it. "I should be the one to go." "You need to stay here and hold the legal line," she said. "You're the only one who can do that. I'm not." She looked at him directly, water running off the brim of her father's hat. "I can ride 20 miles. He held her gaze for a moment. Something moved in his expression. Not doubt, exactly, but the particular discomfort of a person who has made a calculated assessment and doesn't like the outcome even though they know it's right. "Straight road until the Miller Fork," he said. "Take the high branch at the fork. It adds a mile, but it stays above the flood line." "I know the high branch." And if the creek crossing is above the saddle on either horse, I turn back. I know. She started moving toward the livery. I'm not reckless. I didn't say you were. She stopped and looked back at him one more time. He was standing in the rain outside the courthouse with water running off his hat brim, watching her go, and she had a thought she didn't particularly want to examine about what he looked like standing there. Not heroic exactly, not the version of this scene that got written up in the stories, just a man in wet clothes doing calculations about odds and holding his ground. 3:00, she said. Don't let Alcott do anything. She turned and ran for the livery. The ride was bad, and then worse. She took the high branch at the Miller Fork, like Callahan said, and it added 1.5 miles, not 1, because the storm had washed out a section of the track she didn't know about, and she had to go around. The rain came in waves, manageable for a few minutes, then driving so hard she could barely see 20 feet ahead. Her horse, a gray quarter horse named after nothing in particular because she'd never gotten around to naming him properly, was steady through it, but skittish at the sound of water running fast across the road in the lower sections. She reached Thornfield at just past 1 in the afternoon, soaked through to her shirt, mud from the knee down on both legs, and she tied the horse under the feed store overhang and walked into the county filing office, still dripping. The clerk looked at her the way people look at something they don't know what category to put in. I need the original filing for Callaway Land Assessment, Project 417, she said. Submitted approximately 16 months ago. Ma'am, please. She put her hands flat on the counter. I need it in the next hour. It's attached to a legal proceeding in Red Hollow, and I have to be back there by 3. The clerk, who was a young woman not much older than Evelyn, looked at her for a moment with the complicated expression of a government employee weighing procedure against something more immediate. Then she turned and went into the filing stacks. She came back 20 minutes later with a folder. Inside were the original documents: the survey assessment in Hoskins' handwriting, the land parcel numbers, the project description, the date, and at the bottom, the authorizing signature of the filing party. Not Callaway Land Assessment. That was a fiction, a corporate name with no other existence. The actual signature, written in Hoskins' hand with the words filed on behalf of, was followed by a name she recognized: Boone Land and Credit, LLC. Same signature block that was on her father's loan documents. Same corporate seal. She stood in the county filing office in Thornfield with rain still dripping from her hat, and she held the document in both hands and she read it twice. There it was. Not an implication, not a suggestion, not something that required 2 degrees of separation and a legal argument to connect. Direct, documented, in the original handwriting of the man Boone had paid, the same man whose survey identified the water under her eastern section, filed under a false name, using Boone's own corporate stamp. She asked the clerk for a certified copy, which took another 15 minutes, then asked her to hold the originals in the county vault with a formal request notice attached, which the clerk did with the focused efficiency of someone who had decided to be useful. Evelyn was back on her horse by 2:15. She made it back to Red Hollow at 3:50, 45 minutes late, the gray horse breathing hard and mud-spattered to his withers, and she rode straight up the main street through the last of the rain to the courthouse where Callahan was standing outside with the expression of a man who had been managing Alcott for the better part of an hour and was running low on arguments for delay. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, and she handed Callahan the certified copy without a word. He looked at it. His eyes moved down the page to the signature block. He looked up at her. That's everything, she said. She was breathing hard from the last push of the ride, and she was soaked, and her hands were shaking slightly in a way she hadn't noticed until just now. That's every piece of it. Callahan looked at the document for another moment. Then he said quietly, without any performance in it, Yeah, it is. He went inside. Alcott looked at the document for a long time, long enough that the room, Callahan, Pressfield, Boone, Denton behind Boone's chair, and now Evelyn still dripping at the back of the hall, went through a particular kind of silence that had weight to it. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of something irrevocable approaching. Pressfield leaned over and looked at the document too. Evelyn watched his face. He was a careful man, professionally trained to give nothing away, and he gave very little away. But there was something, a slight stillness around his eyes, a pause before his next breath, that told her he understood what he was looking at, and that he hadn't known this specific piece existed. That was important. Pressfield hadn't known. Which meant Boone hadn't told his own lawyer everything. Boone himself sat with his hands resting on his knees, looking at a point on the wall above Alcott's head. He had the quality, she thought, of a man who had been in difficult rooms before, and understood that the first rule of a difficult room was to let nothing show on your face until you knew exactly what you were dealing with. "This is a certified copy," Callahan said, setting the document on Alcott's desk. "The originals are filed under formal request notice in the Thornfield County Vault as of 2 hours ago. The notice prevents removal or alteration without a circuit court order." Pressfield said, "I need to review." "The signature block is on page 3, Callahan said. "Boone Land and Credit LLC, same corporate seal as the foreclosure filing, same as the loan documents. The project name on the county record is Callaway Land Assessment, which does not correspond to any registered entity in this or any adjacent territory." He looked at Alcott. "What it does correspond to is a detailed survey of Miss Mercer's eastern section, identifying a significant subsurface water formation, conducted 16 months before the first missed loan payment, 18 months before the foreclosure action." Alcott cleared his throat. "Mr. Boone, do you have a response?" Boone moved his eyes from the wall to Alcott. "My legal representative will address the procedural questions," he said. His voice was controlled in the way that controlled voices sometimes crack under, not cracking, but with the effort of not cracking audible beneath it. Pressfield put his hand briefly on Boone's arm, a lawyer's gesture meaning, "Let me handle this." Then he stood up and began a line of argument about the document's chain of custody, the reliability of county filing records, and the relevance of a survey to the terms of a loan agreement. It was competent. He was a competent man doing his job. Callahan let him finish. Then he answered each point in sequence, the same way he'd done it all morning, with the unhurried precision of someone who had spent considerably more time preparing for this than the other side had anticipated. Alcott ruled at 4:05. The foreclosure suspension was extended. The auction was stayed pending a formal fraud investigation. The matter was referred to the Territorial Attorney General's office. It wasn't a complete victory. The debt didn't evaporate. The ranch wasn't formally restored in a single stroke, and the Attorney General's investigation would take time Evelyn didn't entirely have. But the auction was stopped. The land wasn't going anywhere. Boone stood up when Alcott finished speaking. He looked at Evelyn across the room. It was a long look, and she met it, and she held it until he looked away. He walked out with Pressfield close behind him and Denton at his shoulder, and the door closed behind them, and the sound of the rain outside came back in. Evelyn sat down in the nearest chair because her legs had made that decision without her input. The thing about a collapse like Boone's was that it didn't happen all at once. It happened in pieces over the following days, each piece revealing something that made the pieces before it make more sense. The first piece was Denton. By the following morning, Denton had left Red Hollow. Nobody saw him go. His horse was gone from the livery before sunrise, and the room he'd been renting at Mrs. Carver's boarding house had been cleared out with the neatness of someone who'd packed carefully and left nothing behind. Cole, the other one, was still in town. He came into the general store that morning and bought tobacco and nodded at Clara Hatch like nothing in particular was happening, but his manner had the quality of a man who was waiting to see which way the ground was going to settle before he decided his next move. The second piece was the documents from Boone's office. She found out about those from Callahan, who'd been up most of the night talking to people she didn't know about. By the time the territorial investigator arrived from the county seat, a man named Garfield, unremarkable looking, with a detailed and methodical mind that became apparent after about 10 minutes in his company, Callahan had already put together an account of who held documents and where. Boone's office had a safe. The safe had papers. The papers, once Garfield got a territorial warrant and opened the safe, contained records of 6 other land transactions in the valley over the previous 3 years, each one with the same underlying pattern: a Boone land and credit loan, a hidden survey or assessment identifying the land's value, a series of engineering interventions that had affected the water supply. The engineering interventions, Evelyn said, when Callahan explained this to her the evening the warrant was executed. They were sitting on the porch of the farmhouse. She'd come back to the ranch that afternoon, needing to be on her own land even if the legal status was still technically in process. What does that mean exactly? Sergeant's North Well, Callahan said, and the Finney Creek section. Remember Sergeant said his water went dry 2 years ago in a June when it shouldn't have? Yes. There's a narrow limestone shelf that runs through the valley underground, about 12 feet down in places. If you drill through it in the right location, you can disrupt the pressure in the formations above it, cause wells to fail that wouldn't have failed naturally. He was quiet for a moment. It's not a common thing to know how to do. It requires a specific kind of geological knowledge. She sat with that. Someone deliberately dried out their wells. That's what Garfield thinks. The records in Boone's safe include survey notes on each property that went into foreclosure. All of them have annotations about water pressure points. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. The timing lines up. Wells fail, drought accelerates the problem, owners fall behind on payments, Boone forecloses. And the drought was real, she said. It covered everything he did. Easiest cover there is. When everything's dying, nobody looks for a reason. She looked out at the eastern section, where Weller's pump was still running, a dark mechanical shape against the evening sky. The water had been running all day. She'd gone out and put her hand in it 3 separate times, which she recognized was probably unnecessary, but had done anyway. The other ranches, she said. Hendricks, Finney, Sargent's parcels. They're Boone's land now. The investigation will determine what happens to them. If the fraud is proven, the original transactions can potentially be voided. He paused. Potentially. It's not certain. The law on this is complicated. But possible. Possible. She nodded slowly. It wasn't the clean result she might have wanted, but she'd stopped expecting clean results sometime in the spring, and there was a kind of clarity in that, in knowing that the outcome was going to be partial and contested and imperfect, and still worth fighting for. The town's response was complicated in the way that towns are when they've been complicit in something without fully knowing it. The people of Red Hollow hadn't known what Boone was doing. That was mostly true. But they'd known enough to feel it now, looking back, seeing the pattern, understanding that they'd accepted things without asking questions because Boone had money and influence and the general aura of authority that money and influence produce. The foreclosures had seemed legal, the auction had seemed legal, everything Boone did had seemed legal because he was careful about the surface of things. Some people in Red Hollow handled this by redirecting their shame into anger, which meant they were suddenly very loud about having suspected Boone all along. Clara Hatch, who had not looked at Evelyn on the day of the auction, was now the most vocal person in town about the injustice of it. Evelyn didn't hold this against her exactly, but she also didn't pretend it hadn't happened. Other people handled it with the specific discomfort of the genuinely guilty feeling, the ones who'd been at the auction and watched and said nothing, and known, somewhere in their gut, that something wasn't right. Twice Johnson, the blacksmith, came out to the ranch 2 days after Alcott's ruling and asked if there was work he could do, any repair work or materials needed. He said it gruffly, without explanation or apology, and she understood it as both. She told him the south fence needed new posts, and he went and did it without being asked twice. Pete Sargent came out the day after Twice Johnson. He was a man who communicated primarily through gesture, so he didn't say much. He brought 2 of his hands, and they spent a day helping Weller and Dale build out the pump housing over the new well into something weather-resistant. She let people help, not because she needed to forgive them or because it resolved anything, but because the ranch needed the work and the people needed to do it, and those 2 things happened to align. Boone didn't leave Red Hollow immediately, which surprised her. She'd expected him to be gone before the investigation was fully underway. He had money, he had resources. He had every practical reason to remove himself from a situation that was collapsing around him. But he stayed, which she eventually understood as a bet he was still making. He had lawyers. He had the circuit judge in the next county who owed him something. He had procedural moves he hadn't played yet. He was at the Spur and Saddle Saloon when she came in looking for Callahan 4 days after the ruling. She didn't plan to speak to him. She walked past his table and he said, "Miss Mercer," and she stopped. "Sit down a moment," he said. She didn't sit down. She stood at the edge of his table and looked at him. He was still the same large, well-dressed man he'd always been, but something in his bearing had changed. Not broken exactly, but settled lower, like a building that's had something removed from its foundation and hasn't collapsed yet, but is telling you something about what's coming. "This is going to take a long time," he said. "Investigations, courts, years possibly." He turned his glass on the table. "I want you to know that whatever happens through all of that, the core legal structure of your father's debt is valid. Even if the fraud findings go against me, you will still owe money." "I know," she said. "The water makes the land worth enough to refinance the debt at reasonable terms with a legitimate lender. I've already talked to one." Something in his expression moved. Not surprise. He wasn't going to let her see surprise, but an acknowledgement that she'd thought further ahead than he'd expected. "You've moved fast," he said. "I've had to." He nodded slowly. "The ranch will do well with water," he said. "I want you to know I understood that. I want you to understand that it wasn't personal." She looked at him for a moment. She thought about how to answer that. She thought about her father's signature on the second set of loan documents, and the years of work those papers had been designed to strip away. She thought about Pete Sargent's wells going dry in a June when they shouldn't have. "I understand that you meant it as business," she said, "but my father built that ranch for 30 years. The people you took land from built their lives on it. The fact that you saw it as a ledger entry doesn't mean it wasn't personal to us." She left him with that and went to find Callahan. She found him at the back table where he was talking to Garfield, the territorial investigator. They wrapped up their conversation when she arrived, and Garfield nodded to her in the way of someone who had absorbed her role in all of this and was treating her accordingly. Not as a bystander, not as a victim, but as a participant whose information was relevant. When Garfield left, she sat down across from Callahan. "He's still trying to work the Judge Peel angle," Callahan said, without her asking. "Garfield's team is looking at Peel's prior rulings. 2 of those 3 decisions in Boone's favor have procedural irregularities." "Will that matter?" "It matters to the investigation. Whether it matters to the outcome depends on how high Garfield's authority actually runs." He turned his own glass on the table. Same movement as Boone, she noticed, and then wished she hadn't. "There are no guarantees. I want to be clear about that." "You've been clear about that from the start." She looked at him. "The other ranches, Hendricks, Finney, is there any real path back for them?" "Hendricks has already been contacted. If the fraud voiding proceeds, he'd be in a position to reclaim under the original deed terms. Finney's situation is more complicated. They sold during the proceedings, not through foreclosure, so the documents are structured differently. But there's a path. There's a path. Whether they can walk it depends on what Garfield finds and what the territorial court does with it." She sat back. Outside the saloon windows, the main street of Red Hollow was wet and quiet, post-storm, the puddles in the road catching the late afternoon light and holding it. Someone was loading supplies at the general store. A dog was doing something to the boardwalk near the feed merchant that its owner should have been watching. "Callahan," she said. He looked at her. "You're going to leave soon." It wasn't a question, exactly. She'd been watching him for the past 4 days, the way he operated in a place once the active crisis had moved into its slower resolution phase. Still useful, still involved, but with a quality she'd noticed in him from the first day, of someone who understood which part of a thing was his to do and which part wasn't. He didn't deny it. "Garfield doesn't need me for the investigation. You don't need me to run the ranch." "I know." She kept her voice steady. "I'm not arguing against it." "All right. I just wanted to say it out loud first, before it happened without being said." He looked at her with those amber eyes that had been reading terrain and people and situations all her life before she'd ever known him. And she thought he was probably a difficult man to be around consistently. Not because he was unkind, but because he kept his own counsel to a degree that would wear on a person, and because he'd spend the rest of his life riding toward the next version of this and never quite stopping. She understood that about him now. Maybe she'd understood it from the start. "The ranch is going to be worth something real," he said. "The water changes everything under it." "I know. You'll have problems you haven't had before. People who want access to the water, disputes about rights, pressure from larger operators who see what you've built. I've handled pressure before. Yes, he said. You have. And it wasn't a compliment exactly, just an acknowledgement, which was better. She finished her drink and stood up. The $4, she said. For the survey maps. He almost smiled again. She was starting to be able to read that expression. The not quite smile that was actually closer to amusement than his full smile would have been. Keep it, he said. I always intended to, she said. I just wanted you to know I remembered. She walked out of the saloon and into the late afternoon street, and the mud pulled at her boots, and the air smelled like wet earth and the particular freshness that comes after a storm breaks. And she walked back to her horse thinking about all the things that were not yet finished, and all the things that were, and all the things that were going to be hard regardless. The investigation would take months. The refinancing terms needed to be finalized. There was a south fence that needed more than just posts, and 43 thin cattle that needed to get not thin, and a pump housing that Sargent's men had built in a day that would need real reinforcement before winter. There was a lot of work. There had always been a lot of work. For the first time in a year, the work had somewhere to go. She untied the horse from the rail and rode home. The investigation took 4 months. Evelyn knew it would take time. Callahan had told her that from the beginning, and Garfield had been honest about the pace of territorial proceedings, which moved according to their own logic and not according to anyone's urgency. So she worked. She got up before sunrise and she worked until she couldn't, and then she slept and got up and did it again, because that was what the ranch required, and because work, she'd found, was the only thing that kept the waiting from hollowing her out. The refinancing came through in August. A lender out of the regional capital, a small institution that dealt specifically with agricultural land, looked at the certified survey of the aquifer, looked at the flow rate Weller had documented, looked at 1,200 acres with guaranteed water in a drought valley, and offered her terms that her father never could have gotten on his best day. She signed the papers at the kitchen table on a Tuesday morning with nobody watching, which was fine. Some things didn't need an audience. The cattle came back, slowly because cattle don't rush about anything, but by September the 43 she'd started with had become 61, 3 of them hers from calves born over the summer, the rest purchased from a rancher 2 counties over who had stock to move. They were not fat yet, but they were no longer thin, which was the most important thing. She hired 2 hands, a man named Ortega, who'd worked cattle operations across the territory for 20 years and had the particular competence of someone who had seen every possible thing go wrong and knew how to handle it, and a younger man named Betts, who was 19 and not yet competent, but was learning fast and didn't complain about the hours. She paid them fairly and on time, which she understood now as the baseline of any working relationship, rather than something that required acknowledgement. The south fence got fixed properly. The barn roof got a new section where the weather had worked through the old boards. The farmhouse porch, which had been sagging since her father had noticed it 3 years ago and not gotten to it, got rebuilt from the joist up by Twice Johnson on a Saturday in October, who showed up with materials without being asked and refused money for the labor. She didn't refuse his help anymore. She'd learned that letting people repair things was sometimes how they repaired other things that couldn't be fixed directly. She understood that now about herself too, that she'd been carrying a particular version of pride that had sometimes looked like strength and sometimes just been stubbornness, and that there was a difference between standing on your own and refusing every hand that reached toward you. Garfield's investigation produced its formal findings in October. The Territorial Attorney General's office issued a 43-page document that Evelyn read in full, twice, at the kitchen table over the course of a single evening. It was dense legal language, and she had to go back through several sections more than twice, but she understood it well enough by the end. The findings confirmed everything: the false survey filing under the Callaway name, the systematic disruption of water sources on properties that preceded Boone's foreclosure actions, the correspondence between Boone and Judge Peel that amounted to a pattern of judicial influence across 3 counties, the records from the safe, 6 transactions in Red Hollow Valley alone, and 14 more across the territory when the investigation expanded beyond what the original warrant had covered. Boone Land and Credit was dissolved by territorial order. Boone's personal assets were frozen pending civil proceedings brought by the Attorney General, which were separate from the criminal referrals. which were separate again from the civil suits being organized by the various parties who'd lost land or money through his operations. Boone himself was arrested on a Thursday morning at the hotel where he'd been staying since the investigation made his continued presence in the office impossible. Cole had left town by then. Pressfield had withdrawn from representation 2 months earlier, citing a conflict of interest he hadn't bothered to specify. She heard about the arrest from Ortega, who'd ridden into town for supplies and come back with the news. She was mending fence on the north pasture when he told her. She set down the fence tool and looked out at the valley for a moment. The sky was the deep blue of late October, high and clear, and the ridge to the north had gone the rusty color it went every fall. She picked up the fence tool and went back to work. She'd thought she'd feel more when it happened. She'd thought there'd be some clean release of something, some moment of satisfying resolution. What she felt instead was quieter than that. Not nothing, but not the thing she'd anticipated either. It was more like the feeling after a long illness finally breaks. Not joy, exactly. More like the absence of something that had been present so long, you'd stopped noticing it as weight until it was gone. The Hendricks decision came down 3 weeks after Boone's arrest. The territorial court voided the original foreclosure sale on the basis of fraudulent inducement. Daniel Hendricks, a man she'd met twice, a weathered, quiet rancher in his 50s who'd watched his family's land go and moved his wife and 3 daughters to a rental on the edge of town, got the deed back. The legal fees were covered by the civil restitution fund the Attorney General had assembled from Boone's frozen assets. She rode over to the Hendricks place the day the family moved back in. Not to make an event of it, she just brought food, cornbread, a roasted chicken, some vegetables from the kitchen garden she'd planted in September, partly as an experiment, and partly because growing something was its own form of argument against hopelessness. She left it on the porch when nobody answered the door, then looked out across the Hendricks land at the dry pasture and the house that had been standing empty since the summer Boone took it. Evelyn knew by then that the Finney situation wasn't going to resolve as cleanly. The Finneys had sold during the proceedings rather than through direct foreclosure. They'd panicked and sold early, and the legal structure of a voluntary sale was different from a foreclosure, even a fraudulently induced one. The restitution fund might give them something. It wasn't the same as giving them back what they'd lost. That was a thing she'd had to accept, that the justice coming out of this was real and also incomplete, that some of what Boone had taken couldn't be fully returned because the taking had already used itself up in other people's lives. She thought about that often, the idea that you could be completely right about what had been done wrong and still not be able to fix all of it. It was a hard thing to sit with. She sat with it anyway, because the alternative was to pretend it wasn't true, and she didn't have the energy for that kind of pretending anymore. Callahan came back in November. She was at the Eastern Well when she heard a horse on the main track, and she looked up and knew it was him before she could see him clearly. Something in the pace, or the silhouette, or just the particular quality of attention she'd developed to that specific direction over the months since he'd left. He looked about the same, maybe a little more weathered, which she wouldn't have thought was possible. He'd lost the beard, which made him look different in a way she couldn't immediately quantify. "You look like the ranch is working," he said, pulling up near the well. "It is." She turned off the pump valve she'd been checking and stood up properly. 61 head now. Ortega thinks we can push to 80 by spring." He looked out at the pasture, at the cattle visible in the middle distance, at the grass that was still thin but had come back in patches where the water had started to reach through the soil. "You've moved fast." "I've had to." He dismounted and let his horse drink from the trough beside the well. "Garfield send you the final findings?" she asked. "Got a copy in Abilene 2 weeks ago." He watched his horse drink. "The Peel referral is going to federal court. Bigger jurisdiction." "I know. Garfield wrote to me about it. Could implicate a lot more than just Boone's territory operations." "I know that too." She looked at him. He had his hat in his hands now, which was the first time she'd seen him without it outdoors. His hair was the dark brown of someone who'd spent considerable time in the sun. "Why did you come back?" she asked. He turned the hat in his hand, same way he'd turned his glass at the saloon back in July. She'd noticed he did things like that when he was thinking through how to say something. "The town wants to do something," he said, "some kind of acknowledgement. For the record." He said it with a specific lack of inflection that told her he was not enthusiastic about this. An acknowledgement. Sergeant's idea. He talked to the town council. They want to put something on the record about what happened and who was involved. He looked at her directly. I told them I wasn't interested in ceremonies. But you came back. You asked me to come back, he said. When you were ready. She remembered that. She'd said it at the saloon the last evening before he left. Come back when it's finished. She hadn't expected him to track it so precisely. It's not finished, she said. The Peel case will take years. The civil suits. The Finney situation is still unresolved. The piece that started here is finished, he said. The rest moves without you at the center of it. She looked at the well. Water was coming out of a hairline connection she hadn't tightened properly, a thin thread of it catching the November light. She leaned down and tightened the fitting with her hand. All right, she said. Stay for a while. The town meeting was on a Saturday, in the courthouse hall where Alcott had made his ruling 4 months earlier. It was not a formal ceremony. Sargent had apparently been firm about that, and she was grateful to him for it. No speeches, no plaques, just the town together in a room, talking honestly about what had happened. There were things said in that room that surprised her. Pete Sargent stood up and said plainly that he'd known something was wrong for 2 years and had stayed quiet because he didn't want the trouble of being right, and he was sorry for that. Twice Johnson said something similar, shorter, more uncomfortable. Clara Hatch said she'd been afraid of Boone and hadn't understood until it was over how much of her daily behavior in Red Hollow had been organized around not drawing his attention, and that she hadn't realized it was fear until the thing causing it was gone. Evelyn listened to all of it. She didn't perform graciousness, didn't make a speech about forgiveness or moving forward. She just listened, because that was what the room needed from her. Someone to receive what was being said without making it easier than it was. When it came to Callahan, Sargent said only that the town wanted it on the record that Rhett Callahan had come to Red Hollow when he didn't have to, had stayed when it was dangerous, and had not asked for anything in return. Sargent said this was not a debt that could be fully repaid, and that the town knew it, and that knowing it mattered. Callahan, sitting to the right of the room with his hat on his knee, nodded once. That was all. He didn't stand up. He didn't speak. He received it with the same economy he brought to everything, and she understood that about him now. That a man who didn't need applause wasn't performing humility. He just genuinely didn't require it. He stayed 4 days. He helped Ortega with a fence section on the eastern boundary that needed 2 people to manage properly. He ate supper at the farmhouse 2 of those evenings, and they talked about things that weren't the ranch and weren't the investigation, about the territory, about places he'd been, about a particularly bad winter he'd spent in a line camp in the Panhandle that had apparently involved weeks of nothing to do, and a book of mathematics he'd found in the camp supply box and read 3 times out of desperation. She found herself laughing at that in a way she hadn't laughed at anything in a year, which caught her off guard and which she didn't hide. On the 4th evening, after supper, she said, "You could stay longer." He was quiet for a moment. "You could," she said again. Not pressing it, just saying it clearly because she'd decided she was done with the kind of restraint that left important things unsaid until they became regrets. "I could," he said, "but you're going to go." "There's a situation in the Panhandle," he said, "similar pattern to this one. A man named Pruitt, working through a credit operation out of Amarillo. 2 families already lost land." He looked at her. "I've got the survey records." She almost smiled. "Of course you do." "It's not that I want to go," he said. "I want you to know that." "I know that." "It's that there's someone who can handle the next part of this." He gestured toward the window, toward the ranch, toward the investigation and the rebuilding and all of it. "And there's nobody else headed to the Panhandle." She looked at him across the table, this man who had ridden into her life at a flat gallop 2 days from nowhere, and then quietly, methodically, piece by piece, helped her rebuild the things she'd been about to lose. Who had not rescued her? She was clear on that, had been clear on it from the day at the well when she'd ridden alone through a storm to Thornfield and back. He had brought tools and knowledge and stubbornness and the particular kind of principle that doesn't announce itself. She had done the work. That was important to her, not because she needed the credit, but because it was true. and the truth of it meant something about what she was capable of that she hadn't fully known before. "Go fix the panhandle," she said. Something in his face moved, not quite the not quite smile, something more than that, something she filed away. "I'll come back through," he said. "I'll be here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere." He left before dawn on the 5th day, which was consistent with how he'd done everything else. Without ceremony, without making an event of it. She heard his horse on the track when she was in the kitchen with the coffee on, and she went to the window and watched the dark shape of him move west toward the freight road until she couldn't see him anymore. She stood at the window for a while after that. She thought about what her father would have made of all of it. She thought he would have been proud and complicated about it. Proud of the ranch, complicated about having left her the mess that made all of this necessary. She didn't think less of him for the loans and the trust placed in the wrong people. She'd trusted wrong people too, had made decisions under pressure that she'd have made differently with more information, had stayed quiet in moments when she should have spoken. Every person in this story had done those things. That was not an excuse. It was just the shape of how people moved through hard circumstances, imperfectly, with partial information, doing the best they could, and sometimes not doing that. What she'd come to understand, across all of it, was that the difference between surviving something and being destroyed by it wasn't about being the kind of person who didn't make mistakes. It was about being the kind of person who kept going after they did, who picked up the fence tool, who rode 20 miles in a storm, who looked at a deed that was about to stop being hers and decided, in the face of every practical reason not to, that she wasn't done yet. That was not a lesson anyone had taught her. It was something she'd learned from necessity, which is the most permanent kind of learning there is. By the following spring, the eastern pasture was green. Not everywhere. Nature doesn't flip like a switch. But in patches that expanded week by week as the water table rose through the land and reached roots that had been waiting underground for years. The grass came back the color she remembered from childhood, the deep, thick green of a valley with water under it. The cattle moved into the eastern section and worked it with the focused attention of animals that understand a good thing when they find one. Word had spread through the valley that Mercer Ranch had water, the way word spreads in drought country, which is fast and with the quality of something people needed badly enough to treat as news worth sharing. 3 neighboring ranchers came to her about water rights. She negotiated each one carefully, with Ortega at her side and the survey documents on the table, and she came away with agreements that were fair without being generous, which was the right position for someone who understood that water in a dry valley was not charity, but a resource that could support a community if managed with intention. The spring calving was the best she'd ever seen on the property. 84 head by April, which was what Ortega had predicted, and he had the satisfied expression of a man who trusted his own arithmetic. Betts, who had not been competent when she hired him, had become competent. She gave him a raise at the end of March, and he received it with the slightly stunned expression of someone who hadn't expected to be seen, which made her think about all the years of ranch workers her father had employed who'd probably felt the same way and never had it expressed. She thought, this is one thing I can do differently. The farmhouse porch, rebuilt by Twice Johnson in October, didn't sag. She sat on it in the evenings when the work allowed, the same way her father had, and she looked out at the land in the changing light, and she thought about things without needing them to resolve into conclusions. She'd gotten better at that, at letting a thing simply be what it was, present and unfinished and still worth sitting with. Callahan's letter came in April, postmarked Amarillo. It was short, 3 paragraphs. The first said the Pruitt situation in the Panhandle was breaking the way he'd expected. Documentation solid, 2 families with a real shot at recovery. The second said the weather in Amarillo was bad and the food was worse. The third said he'd be coming through Red Hollow in June, if that was all right. She read it twice at the kitchen table with the morning coffee. Then she went to her desk, her father's old desk, which she'd cleaned out and reorganized in the fall and made her own. And she wrote back. She told him the ranch had 84 head and the east pasture was green. She told him Sargent's North Well had been restored and was running clean. She told him Hendricks had started planting the west section of his reclaimed land. She told him Betts had learned to rope without embarrassing himself, which had taken considerable time. She told him June was fine. She sealed the letter and set it on the desk to go out with the next post. And she looked out the window at the eastern pasture in the April light, at the cattle moving through the new grass, at the valley that was coming back around in the slow, patient way that things come back when the conditions are right, and someone has done the work to make them so. She had not saved this land by being exceptional. She had not saved it by being fearless or brilliant, or by having the right person show up at the right moment, though that had mattered. She had saved it by refusing one day at a time to accept that the story was over when someone else decided it was, by riding in the storm when the storm was what the moment required, by learning which hands to take and which to extend and how to tell the difference. The land had always had water under it. She just hadn't known to look. She thought that was probably true of most things, that the resources exist, the strength, the capacity, the way through, before the crisis forces you to find them, that the real discovery isn't the water itself, but the knowledge that it's there, that it was always there, that you were never as close to the end as the people trying to take something from you needed you to believe. Red Hollow was going to be all right. Not perfect. It would have bad years and complicated people and disputes that took too long to resolve, same as it always had. But the drought that had been killing it wasn't only weather. Some of it had been a man and a system, and a silence that let both of them operate. The silence was broken now. That changed the conditions. She pushed back her chair, put the letter by the door for post, and went to start the day. The coffee cup on the desk was empty. The cattle needed moving to the north section. The fence on the back perimeter had a section she'd noticed yesterday that was going to need attention before the week was out. There was, as always, a lot of work. She was glad for it.